started, and Steve and I, our schedule is all messed up. Like yesterday felt like Saturday, today feels like Sunday. So on a beautiful Saturday morning. So there we go. Make sure we got our days straight. Thanks for being here. To those of you who were here last night, glad to see you again. And for those of you that could not be here last night, we're glad you're able to make it for today's sessions. And it's kind of a dangerous thing when I walk up to the podium without notes. So I do have a little bit of an outline here, just a few things to highlight. If you didn't get a folder, red, blue, green, yellow, orange, something, raise your hand. Steve can bring you a folder. In the folder, you'll have note paper, index cards for writing questions. And Jon told us he loves questions. That way, he's really addressing the thoughts that are going in your mind. He can be addressing those directly. So please make out questions, fill out questions. When we take our break at the end of this session in roughly an hour or so, you can either leave your questions on the inside of the aisle and we'll pick them up, or on your way out of the sanctuary before you exit the doors, we have a gray basket and you can drop your questions in the basket, and then that gives Jon a few minutes to look over them before starting session 3. Oh, and there's extra cards at the gray basket, right, again, before you exit the sanctuary. We'll be taking a break in about an hour or so, maybe a little more than that, and we'll still have drinks and coffee and, more food out there because we all love food and drinks. And feel free anytime during the session if you need to get up. If you had a bunch of coffee but you didn't have any water this morning, then you need to go drink your water. So feel free to get up during the session. If you need to go out, get something to drink, you can bring food and drinks into the sanctuary, and I will deal with the housekeeper later. his wrath. No, it's fine. Any other things, Steve? Anything I'm forgetting? Anything I'm missing? Okay. Well, thanks, Jon. Jon Bohley from Spring Haven Counseling Center, and we'll let you have at it. Thanks.
All right. Am I on okay? Okay. All right. Well, yes, great to see so many people back today. Saturday morning, there's a lot of things that you could be doing. And so choosing to be here to hear more about mental health it's encouraging for me to see. You'll kind of notice a pattern throughout the retreat here, the presentations, where last night was about stress. Stress would easily apply to everybody, right? Very relatable. I'm going to keep getting more and more specific about mental health as we go. This might feel deeper and deeper as we go. So really do take advantage of the questions, because again, I'm going to share what I feel like can be useful for people really wanting to engage mental health and not being afraid to get a little bit deeper with that. But I know that I'm giving you what you're looking for when you write a question. And so do feel free to do that. Also, thank you for everyone who's been supporting the Spring Haven Compassion Fund. Just in case that wasn't explained, what that fund is, it's just money that we use to make counseling more affordable for people who need help. So people where cost might otherwise be a barrier for them to get counseling, that's just our fund to reduce their cost. So thank you all for supporting that too. All right, well, let me just open with a bit of prayer again. Get started. I just thank you again for this space, for this people, for the hearts willing to listen. Again, I just pray that that you speak, that this presentation be what you have to say. Lift this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Springhaven and mental health is not it's not a modern invention. The idea of struggling, of deep emotional pain, is not a new thing. I'll go through a few verses here. Now, O Lord, take away my life. It is better for me to die than live. Right? It was Jonah. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. It was Elijah. 1 Kings 19:4, if you're looking them up, or Jonah 4:3. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. It was Jesus. You want to Matthew 26:38. You'll see a lot of this in the Psalms, right? I mean, just one example. My God, why have you forsaken me? You so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Right? Psalms 22. A lot of us can relate to some of these feelings. Certainly know people who can relate to these feelings. The mental health field is maybe just an update in language and how we talk about what we're going through, but they're not new experiences. They're not, they are what has been common to humanity since the beginning. And so I do want to talk a little bit about, all right, mental health, the kind of some of the language behind it, what is it, so you'll hear that word a lot, mental health or mental illness, right? So officially, a mental illness is just a condition that affects a person's thinking, feelings, mood, or behavior. That's the official definition. And so, like common sorts of words you'd hear with that, like diagnosis you'd hear is like, oh, depression, or like maybe more specifically, major depressive disorder, right? Or anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar. Last night we heard the words post-traumatic stress disorder or obsessive-compulsive disorder. Okay, yeah, these are all sort of disorders or conditions that we would call different types of mental illness. There's a lot of different types of mental illness. I guess one way that I would think about this too is if you just sort of imagine a continuum. Lots of people have lots of things going on, right? Like some people might be asking themselves, the point of this is not to diagnose anyone or yourself, but you kind of, you're listening to mental health, you're like, I don't know, am I depressed? Do I have depression? I mean, sad sometimes, And so when in the mental health world, we're talking about mental illness, we sort of draw a line where we say, so we imagine a line here, and we say, boy, if you have enough of an issue, we'll just talk about depression, if you have enough, then that crosses the line. And then we'd say, you have major depressive disorder, right? And if you have, sad, you're blue, you're down some, but not as much, we say, oh, well, yeah, you're dealing with something, we wouldn't call it major depressive disorder, right? And so, and not that there's always a big difference, but what this line is that it is significantly impacting your life. So your work, your relationships, your life, it's having a significant negative impact on your life. Now, even with that language, So something like major depressive disorder, there would be 9 symptoms that we would look at. And if someone has 5 of those 9 symptoms, then we'd say, oh, that qualifies for that diagnosis, right? Like, you now have that one. Now, someone else might have, like, if someone has the top 5 symptoms, someone else might have the bottom 5 symptoms. To both of those people, we'd say, yes, you qualify for major depressive disorder. But they might only have one overlap. They might look very, very different. Not everybody with major depressive disorder looks the same. In fact, it can be pretty widely different. The other issue, just to keep in mind as we're sort of engaging this world a little bit or learning more how to talk with people about mental health things, is that diagnosis is always more complicated than what we tend to talk about. And that's okay, but for example, most people would say, oh, I have depression, right? Or some people would hear the word, oh, I have bipolar, right? There are lots of types of bipolar that are all pretty unique in their own way, that someone like me, someone who's like studying it, would be attuned to, but most people just in conversation aren't going to recognize that difference, right? And so there's a fair amount of complexity involved in diagnosis, but you can sort of notice, okay, the line is, it's significantly negatively impacting my life. Now, some issues, I'll say, are chronic, like the prognosis. Some issues are going to be long-term. So, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar, some of these, we would expect you're going to be dealing with that your whole life. It can get better managed through things like medication and treatment, but if you stop medication, you're probably going to have symptoms resume. Some mental health conditions are not chronic. Some mental health conditions, things like panic attacks, things like different forms of anxiety, some types of depression, some are not chronic at all. In fact, what we would expect is if you get treatment, those symptoms, you'll probably be fine. Once you no longer have this amount of symptoms, you kind of come back over here, and we say, oh, no, you don't have mental illness anymore. Like you did for a time, right? Like you went through a season of struggling with something, you got help, and now you don't anymore. It's resolved. So it can be both chronic or short-term. A lot of things don't resolve themselves. So for example, somebody struggling with panic attacks, if they get treatment, if they get counseling for panic attacks, probably within a couple of months, they'll no longer have panic attacks. For most people, if that's the pure issue. If you don't get help for it, you could easily have that your whole life. I mean, they don't just go away on their own necessarily. And so, but yeah, chronic or short-term. But it's important to notice it's a real thing. It's a real thing. So we'll get into here another pretty bad drawing. All right. And again, this might all be going a bit deeper than you want to go, but I think it is helpful to see that, that, again, I have the type of drawing that I have to tell you what it is. That's a neuron. So that's a brain cell, right, called a neuron. And the way a neuron works, I'll draw another one here. Okay. A neuron will have kind of arms. You have to sort of imagine this is three-dimensional. There's arms going in all directions, but they're filled with chemicals called neurotransmitters, okay? So what Some of you probably hear the words like, oh, dopamine, right? That's a common one a lot of people use. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. Like, oh, those are the chemicals inside. And what they do is they will shoot down this arm called an axon. They'll get into this gap called a synapse. And then some of them will absorb into the next neuron, creating an overflow in this one. Now that there's extra in this one, it fires, right? And that creates an extra, and it fires. And then depending on which chemical is released and in which part of the body, that's going to create different feelings, different sensations, okay? You can watch these in like a brain scan. It kind of looks like lightning. You know, they can measure brain activity through scans and looking at things like this. But when we're dealing with things like major depressive disorder, it's different than just feeling blue. There's a change in the chemical composition of the mind. That's a real physical difference. And so sometimes it might have to do with how neurons are produced, sometimes, or how neurotransmitters are produced, the chemicals like serotonin itself, how it's produced. Sometimes it's an issue of how it fires or how it absorbs. How we think, how we act, medication, all of these things can impact this. But it's just important to recognize, sometimes we hear in the mental health world like, wow, it's just in your head, right? Just get over it. Like, it's just feel better. And it's just useful to recognize, well, I mean, we are dealing with real chemicals. It's not just a made-up list of symptoms. Okay, so now before I go any further about some of the technicality here, I do just want to recognize that there historically has been a fair amount of tension between mental health and the church. And I do have some ideas about that. In the early 20th century is sort of when the mental health field began emerging. And the person really at the forefront of that was Sigmund Freud. He's sometimes called the father of modern psychology or talk therapy. And he was a doctor, and he was kind of the first person in the medical community that began to notice, like, oh, we can help alleviate people's symptoms, we can help alleviate their problems by talking with them. There's something to, and there's a way of going about talking with people that can help their symptoms. And so instead of just medication as the only option, like, he began to study and discover this. And he was helping people, but Sigmund Freud also was very much against the church. So here's this leader of this mental health movement that was emerging, and he would say things like, religion creates weakness. And that he wrote that he had hoped that science and reason would replace faith in God. It was part of his mission. He was really hoping to get rid of religion. So if I am a Christian in the early 19th century, and this kind of new thing is emerging, and it is very anti-Christian, I too would be very guarded against it, right? Like, I think there was a lot of wisdom in the early church to say, you know, I'm not sure we want to jump on board with this whole mental health thing, right? I think that makes sense. That wasn't the end of the story, though. Beginning in the World Wars, mental health hospitals started to popularize, and then specifically Mennonites began serving in mental health hospitals in larger numbers during the wars, and they brought their values with them. It's just, a part of who they were. That's what they brought with them when they were serving in this field. And then in the 1960s, kind of the late 1960s, is when this idea of of Christian counseling began to emerge. That within the mental health field, Christians began identifying models for helping people that fit with their faith and values. And so today we have lots of places that would call themselves Christian counseling. And I'll just explain a few of those terms as you go. So Springhaven would say we're professional Christian counseling. Professional counseling just means our therapists are licensed by the state we all have graduate degrees in counseling, and we're licensed by the state to do professional therapy. And we're all Christians who give out of our faith and can incorporate faith into how we treat people. Professional counseling by itself, professional counseling just means licensed by the state. There's lots of professional counseling places that are just people who are licensed by the state. The people serving in them may be Christian and may not be, right? But that's professional counseling. And then pastoral counseling, or sometimes it might be called Christian counseling or lay counseling or pastoral counseling, is also, usually it's a person who's not a licensed therapist, but who does meet with people and help people. So sometimes pastors will do this to some amount. Sometimes people will go do a little bit of extra training and make it more of a focus. They're not licensed, but they are able to come alongside. They wouldn't diagnose and treat, right? Like they're not telling you whether it's bipolar or not, but they are able to listen and to provide support and to give wise counsel. And so I don't necessarily view these as competitive fields, but more cooperative. I work alongside plenty of pastoral counselors who they're doing their role with an individual that's getting helped, and I'm doing mine, and then we're talking with each other. But when you're completely new to the field and you're just trying to figure it out, it can feel a bit confusing, right? Like, well, what is it? Is a Christian counselor? Is that professional? Is that pastoral? But that's what those different terms all mean. And we might even ask, as we're wading into like more and more complicated language, like, well, all right, why are we doing this again? Why did we come here Saturday morning? The 20% of adults currently are struggling with a mental health issue. 20%, 1 in 5. So I would guess there's a decent chunk here, right? 50% will at some point in their life. Again, not all mental health conditions are chronic, but about 50% of adults will have a mental health problem at some point in their life. So it would be pretty rare that if you don't have or have had some form of mental health issue at some point in your life, that you don't at least know somebody who has, right? If you have more than 2 friends, you probably know somebody who's at least at some point been through something. And that's part of what the mental health field is to me. Again, when in Galatians we read, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, good. How do I be loving? How do I, a lot of us have been on the faith journey for a long time, and it's kind of a perpetual question. I want to keep getting better at this. How do I be loving? And when I look around and see, I see people struggling with things, how do I be helpful to them, right? How do I love somebody who's struggling? I think that's the perfect question for a church to be asking, right? Does anybody know what the first not good thing in the Bible is? The first not good? No, it's a funny question. So when, just Genesis 1, during creation, right? God creates and he calls things good, right? Like he makes the light and it's good. He makes the land and the seas and it's good. He makes the vegetation and it's, he kind of keeps going. Each day he makes something and he calls it good. And then he looks at the whole thing and he says it's very good. So there's this pattern, this rhythm. I make it, it's good. I make it, it's good. And then God says that something is not good. This is before the fall, before sin. He says something is not good, which sort of stands out. You're like, oh, wow, everything's been good so far. What is not good? Not good for man to be alone. It's not good for man to be alone. People struggling with mental health oftentimes feel alone. They aren't all, in the beginning of dealing with a mental health issue, they don't know what's happening, right? Like, it's not like somebody wakes up one morning and goes like, oh man, shoot, did I just catch a little bit of major depressive disorder? Like, we don't know what's going on. We feel not good. We feel run down. We feel not great, right? We're not sure why or what it is. We might feel a little embarrassed about feeling down. We kind of don't want to be a burden on the people around us. You know, we put on a good face, like, oh, we're okay. We're doing good. Well, we're certainly not sure how to get help with it. It lingers for quite a while before, for most people, before it ever gets bad enough that they're asking for any amount of help. C.S. Lewis said, mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, but it's more common and harder to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain, to hide it, to conceal mental pain, increases the burden. It's just easier to say, my tooth is aching, than to say, my heart is broken. And so people struggle. They're not sure why. They don't know what's going on. They're just not feeling good, and they're not sure what to do about it. And so the big question that sort of I'm imagining you're asking is partly, okay, great, got it, John. Like, what do we do? We're in. How do we help? I think the first thing that there's two big ways that people can help, and for this session, I'm going to talk to my notice and refer people. Some of you are going to be notice and refer people. Some of you are going to be walk with them people, right? I'm going to talk to my walk with them people and after the break for the second session. But a lot of people are going to be, I'm just going to be a notice and refer person. Okay, good. Your first question is then, all right, so what do I look for? What do I look for? A lot of people ask that question. Most people know the answer, right? So when we're talking about this, I'm not really training you to be going and approaching strangers on the street. You know what I mean? Like, this is people in your life that you care about, right? It's friends and family, it's coworkers, it's church members, it's people that you have relationship with. And when you're in relationship with somebody, you notice when they're struggling, right? Like, they seem, their mood has shifted. They might be isolating more, kind of staying in more. They might be getting irritable more often. They might be more withdrawn. They're not taking care of themselves as much as they used to. They're kind of getting away from hobbies or interests. They're on edge a lot more often. Like, you're just seeing this shift in them. And we're not looking at, like, somebody had a bad day and we're like, oh my gosh, did you catch the mental illness? You know, it's not. It's not like that. But if you see a pattern, right? Like, oh man, this pattern has kind of been going on for some time now, where there's a change in their behavior, their mood, and how they act, how they relate. That's all we're looking for, right? I see a shift, and it's been going on for a little while now. It seems like, oh, not just a tough day, not just a rough week. This has been a few weeks. This has been a month. This has been longer. This is, and so we see that shift, and we say, all right, I see something's going on. Now what do I do? My first advice is to beware of conversation stoppers, or to beware of quick advice. Quick advice has hurt a lot of people. As a therapist, I'll get a lot of people in my office who love their church, but have felt very hurt by their church. And I think it's unintentional. I think it's usually well-meaning people, but we give advice that would work for us, right? Like, man, I don't have mental illness, and if I'm feeling a little bit blue, just the reminder that, like, oh, maybe I need to, hey, you know what? Let go and let God. Keep praying. Remember, cast your burdens on the Lord. Like, I get this quick advice that would be maybe a useful reminder for me is not a useful reminder for them. The way I think of that is like, so we can all relate to eating too many sweets and then feel that like energy spike and then feeling sluggish, right? Like we can all relate to that. We get that, right? And if I'm feeling that and you'd hear it and you'd be like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, me too, But if we're talking to a person with diabetes where they produce insulin, they process sugar differently than we do on a chemical level, then our advice about like, oh yeah, I get it, that energy shift, like, we don't get it. That's not what they're experiencing. It is different on a chemical level. And people struggling with major depressive disorder, I keep coming back to that one because it's a common one. You fill in any disorder you like. People struggling oftentimes have this mental tape in their head that something like, I'm not good enough, I don't matter, I'm not important, people don't care about me, I'm a failure, right? Something in that line, I'm not very good enough. And they don't want to burden other people, they don't want to bring other people down, they try and hide it, right? But there's just this, I'm not good enough. And then you're feeling blue is kind of showing like, oh yeah, we'll keep praying, And how that hits them is they'll come in to my office feeling like such a failure. Listen, I am a terrible Christian, right? Everyone else in my church, like, they pray and they get better. I pray, I still feel awful. I've not gotten any better. I'm worse than everybody else. I'm a special type of bad that no one else is, right? And so we just want to be a little careful about quick advice, because sometimes we're over-identifying. We're telling them what would be useful to us, and we're just missing that they're going through something different, okay? What you can do is check in with them. Ask them how they're doing. Let's put this down. I would say that you don't do this Sunday morning. Right? Like, sometimes, for some of us, that's their only contact with each other. You need to make it not your only contact. If you care enough to be engaging in their mental health, that needs to be not your only contact with them. Sunday morning, for me, and I don't want to, you guys, you may be different. In my church experience, Sunday morning, I've kind of got a clock in my head of like, okay, we're going to socialize and chat for, 5 or 6 minutes, and we're going to come in, and we're going to chat for a couple of minutes. I've got young kids I got to pick up from like kids community, and then they're going to be running around. So I've got a timer that if I'm chatting with anybody, 5 minutes would be a long conversation. It's probably 1 or 2 minutes, right? So when people ask, right, oh, how are you doing? The right answer is good, how are you, right? And they're meant to say, oh, good, right? And that's about what you have time for. And so if you're going to check in with people, don't ask a question that they don't have time to answer, thinking that they'll answer. Don't with a 2-minute time window, say, no, really, how are you doing? They don't have time to answer that. Create space to really check in. Go out to coffee, have them over to your house. Create space to really check in. And when you're checking in, you're just noticing things like, oh, we don't want a lot of distractions. We don't want a lot of other people around. If they're sharing something that they're not very sure about and they maybe are embarrassed about, they don't want a ton of people. They want a little privacy, right? Like, they want a ton of people overhearing that. And so try and create a space where they could answer that question. Okay. A couple of other tips when you're checking in. You've created space. You're at your house. There's not a ton of people around. Hey, how are you doing? Oh, good. Talking about your own stress a bit can sometimes help relax people into them opening up about theirs, right? Being willing to share, that make the whole thing about yourself, but you're saying, I've identified somebody that I think is struggling more than normal. I would like to check in with them. You've created space. You've asked, oh, good. Okay, good, yeah, man, I just know it's been a tough time, and yeah, I feel like I'm having a tough time keeping up with stuff. You can share a bit about your experience. And if the relationship supports it, again, don't, if this isn't a person you've ever had a serious conversation with, I'm not sure you're the right person to be doing that, right? You might find somebody who's in closer relationship with them. But when the relationship supports it, you can push in a little, right? I've just noticed that you seem like you haven't been quite yourself lately. I've noticed you haven't seemed like you've been quite yourself lately. I just wanted to know that I care. I notice and I care. One of the big things that people with mental health struggle with is, again, before they know what's going on, before they're in treatment, before in the beginning, they struggle with is they don't know what's going on well enough that they're going to go initiate the conversation and say something, and they don't think that anybody really notices them. They might think they're hiding it fine, and they maybe like that they're being saved from the embarrassment of that, they're showing signs that they're not doing well. But they kind of wish somebody would check in. They kind of wish someone would notice, that someone would notice and care, right? And so when you are able to say, hey, I just, it looks like maybe, I've just noticed you haven't been quite yourself. Maybe you've been struggling, and I just want you to know I care. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here, right? And so that you've noticed, you've checked in. The third thing, there's going to be 4, by the way. The third thing, let you know where we're at time-wise here. Third thing is help them feel normal about seeing a counselor. help them feel normal about seeing a counselor. If they're dealing with mental health issue, they should see a counselor. And here's the way, the attitude that you can foster in yourself toward this could be, imagine I was up here and I had a broken arm. Broken so bad the bone was coming out, like broken arm, right? What advice might you give me? Go to the doctor. And I'm like, no, it's okay, I think I'm fine. They're like, no, seriously, go to the doctor. I'm like, well, I've been to a doctor before, I don't really like going to the doctor. Yeah, no, I hear you, but like seriously, that needs a doctor, right? It's the same with mental health. If you're dealing with a mental health issue, you need a counselor. You need somebody who is trained and able to support what you're going through, that can help guide you through it, who can help get you connected with medication if necessary, but who can help. And the more that I think this happens in churches too. There could be a stigma about like, well, are we supposed to be going to a counselor? I'm not sure if that's the right thing. Ought we be doing that? And sometimes feel embarrassed or ashamed about it. When it's normal to you and it's the right thing to do, it helps it feel normal to them. That breaks their ice. A lot of times people ask me like, well, how do I help get someone into counseling, right? Like they feel weird about it. They maybe aren't sure they want to go. How do I help them go? One is you being comfortable, like you knowing, yeah, no, this is the right thing. There's nothing to feel weird about. And the more that it's accepted, the easier it is. I'll see this in communities all the time. We see this a lot with different Amish churches. Oftentimes the way that it'll work is nobody from a given community will use counseling. Like just professional counseling is not okay. No one will use it. Eventually, some reason or another, someone will use it, right? Maybe someone's got a mental health condition that's so severe and disruptive, and someone kind of guides them into counseling. Someone, once they get help, and once the church, oftentimes in this case, the bishop says, counseling is okay, then everyone starts going, right? And it will switch like that in a given church from nobody from that community will come to half that community will be into counseling because it got declared clearly, no, it's okay, go do that, right? Now it's normal, now I use it. So help people feel normal about getting counseling. And then the fourth thing, our last thing, pray for them. Pray for them. People struggling with mental illness are more vulnerable to spiritual attack. Like they do need prayer. I think that sometimes, especially if people are calling my office and asking, like, oh man, how do I help this person? Oftentimes they feel let down by that advice, pray for them. I think maybe that's because they're already doing it, right? They're like, no, I'm doing that, what else can I do? But I don't want to skip it either. I think that is an important part of people's recovery. I think that God can move and open people's hearts in a way that we don't always see, and to not give up on persistent prayer. James 5:16, therefore confess your sins one to another and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. So obviously we're not telling people who are struggling, oh, just pray for it, you should be fine, right? Like we're not, but do pray for them. Do pray for them. Okay, so just brief recap. 4 main ways to help. Beware of conversation stoppers. Beware of just quick advice, right? Oftentimes that's because, if we're to notice it, we feel uncomfortable with their distress, and so we're just trying to get them to move on, right? Like, oh yeah, man, you ask somebody how they're doing, they're supposed to say good, but they don't. They say, man, it's been really rough, All right, a door's been cracked, right? Now, if you're uncomfortable, then you'll say, like, well, hang in there, right? I'll be praying for you. If you're comfortable, if you can handle the distress of them, if you can bear their burden with them, then you can ask more questions. You can keep listening. You can create space to check in. When you check in, you can push in a little. You can ask more directly. You can help them feel normal about seeing a counselor. And you can keep praying for them. Keep praying for them. I'm not watching my time at all. Sorry. Okay, good. So, we have about 20 minutes. We can end a little early if we need to, but we have about 20 minutes for questions. And so you have cards with you. Again, I do like questions because now I know I'm hitting at what you're looking for. If you want to just slide them to the edge of the pews or something, we'll be along and pick them up here. Also, if you think of a question maybe during this time or later, and you don't have your card up, there's a box in the back. Where's the box? Okay, there's a box in the back. And so if, like even during the break, you drop any questions in there, then I'll catch them at the end of the last session. All right. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask out loud sort of while we're collecting cards? Just give that opportunity. Oh, wow, good.
More than you had last night.
That's a lot of questions. Yeah, that's great. That's great. All right. Nothing out loud.
Talk about the percentage of adults struggling with mental health issues. What is the percentage of youth, teenagers?
Yeah, I don't have that statistic memorized. It's similar. I don't go a lot into the rates of suicide from mental health go up quite a bit with teens, so that's higher than with adults. But mental health itself is pretty similar. Oh. Can a mental health issue be genetic? Yes. Yes, it can. What we've learned through twin studies is that it is not completely genetic. Two people with identical genes do not always have the same mental health conditions. It's not 100% genetic. But if you have a family history of something, you are more likely to have it than the general population. So it is partially genetic. When it comes to addiction, I view addiction as mental health, like that's part of the mental health field. That's also one of the big factors of addiction. And so just to there's actually three major factors for addiction. And so, and the first one is genetic. And so that's our bottom. And if we cross this line up here, we're now into addiction, then some people might have a lot of genetic background with addiction. And some people might have a moderate amount or a very small amount. The second factor is stress. So some people have a very stressful home life, work life, economic structure. Some people have a lot of stress. Some people have kind of a moderate amount or very little. And the third factor is use. So how much of that drug or substance, or sometimes it might be pornography or gambling or drugs or alcohol, how much of it do they use? Here, just the small amount of use is going to cross that line for them. They'll be addicted. This person can use the same amount and not be addicted. But there is an amount they can use that will get them there. And the same here. If you use enough, you'll get there. But the genetic factor is just one of the contributing sources. Feel free to ask follow-up questions as I answer a question, too. Make sure. All right, how does one handle the stress of a person who constantly calls with demands? Okay, so a person might be disabled and not making progress, refuses therapy. I'm going to save this question because I'm actually going to talk about this a fair amount in the next section. And so it's a good question. I'll get into it more. If after the next section I don't answer that, then ask it again. But I think I will cover it. Another one about genetics, or heredity is just another word for genetics. Okay, so yeah, here's a good comment. So just the idea that, I believe everyone could profit from counseling, but at what point is it essential to get help or to go to professional counseling? And for me, I agree. I think, counseling could help everybody, but not everybody needs it, right? And so to me, it's when there is a pattern of change where they are having a more difficult time dealing with life than is normal for them, right? And so now some people may have been struggling for years and years and years, in which case, yeah, if you're struggling a lot, get help, right? But there are a lot of people who might think of, like, I am struggling more now than I used. I don't feel like myself exactly. There was a time that I would handle things much better, and it has shifted for me, and it's showing up. It's showing up. It's hurting my relationships. It's hurting my work. It's hurting my faith in some way. Like, the way that I engage with others has shifted, and I'm seeing important parts of my life being negatively impacted by how I'm struggling. That's a clear line to get help. Yeah. What's the average cost of professional counseling? Does insurance pay for counseling? What other services and financial might help be available? It's a great question. So counseling, individual counseling, like if you're self-paying and not using insurance, I think it's like $85 a session at Springhaven, and that's pretty average in the field. You'll find places that are more and some that are less. Like the insurances do cover counseling. All insurances are required to cover counseling. You'll want to make sure that your insurance, each individual counselor would need to be paneled with your insurance, and so you would need to make sure, you can call your insurance company or the counseling agency and ask them, hey, is this person covered by my plan to be a network? But insurances will cover counseling. And then there are other financial supports. So I know that a lot of churches Sonnenberg has in the past, I know we do a church partnership plan, and so a church will pay sort of a portion of someone's counseling, and then Springhaven can help pay some, or we leave a portion for the person but have a reduced cost. There are lots of employers that have what we call EAPs, employer-assisted programs, where the employer has an added benefit of providing counseling. We have several of those. Springhaven's Compassion Fund, which I named earlier, is another way that Springhaven will just reduce the cost for you using those funds. And so And that's a mix of a portion of our own budget that Springhaven has with donations from the community as well. And then the largest sliding fee scale is community mental health. So community mental health would be tax-supported agencies. They won't be Christian, although they could have Christians working in them. I worked in community mental health for years, right? So you could have Christians working in them. But around here, it'd be like the Counseling Center or Anazao or Catholic Charities. Like those are the ones that get large amounts of money from the government, from taxes. And then if your income meets a level, they can provide free counseling for you. So.
Community health, if you work in community health, are you restricted about using Christian?
It's a good question. A little. The way I'd say that is, for most therapists, so my experience in community mental health was, technically, I know through my training that you're allowed to engage people where they're at. And so if faith is important to them, I'm allowed to engage faith. In my experience, I had supervisors that were very against engaging in faith issues. And so I could technically do the same thing there as I do now, but just the tone of it was, boy, if anybody complains there, I get in a lot of trouble. And if anybody complains now, like, no, it's okay. Yeah, sometimes people, it's not as, it's more supported, I'd say. So they can, and some will be comfortable, but some might be a little less comfortable because of the structure they're in. Yeah. Good. Yeah, any other questions about that? Cost and things? Was good. Why do people so often go off their meds? Yeah, I get it. I think that there is this sense of like, I don't want medication. I get tired of taking it. Lots of people feel that with everything else, right? Like you're going through, cancer medication, diabetes, heart, blood pressure. You just get sick of taking pills. You're like, I don't want to have to need this stuff. And so when you start feeling better, when the medication is working, then like, I'm feeling fine. Like, why am I taking this all the time? I feel fine, right? And so then you get off it, and then you get worse again, right? And then hopefully you recognize that and get back on it, right? It's rough for the people around them. Like when you care about somebody and they're a weight on you, like you care about them and you see them really hurting their life, and it's like, man, will you please just stay on this? But people do tend to do that. We try and provide a lot of education and support so that people don't so much. The exception would be, there are some issues where short-term medication might be effective, where you can get on something for a time, you get some counseling, you learn some new skills and tools, and things shift for you, and then you're able to get off medication and it goes fine. So it is possible to have something that is not a long-term thing. But with the long-term things, it is best to think of it like your diabetes medication, right? I just take it every day as a matter of function because this is what helps my chemical balance even out. And yeah. The other thing about medication, I can say, medications come a long way. So there is a fear, or there has been a fear about like, well, I don't want to be a zombie. I don't want to be drugged up. I don't want to be, they did in the early, like in the 60s, 70s, like they would hit people pretty hard with medication. And there weren't as many medications available back then. And so like that image of like, man, they're just people seem drugged up. Like, I mean, it's not completely fake. Like, I get where that comes from. We've come a very long way. Lots of medications have developed, and doctors now don't, they start with a very mild dose. And usually the issue is like, oh, it helps a little, but not much. Yeah, it's because they started so small. Like, they'll inch it up so that they're finding the minimum amount that's useful so that you're not getting too much. The way that most medications for depression, like the most common kind of class of medication, this might be, we'll see. This might be a little deeper than you wanted to know. The most common class is called SA, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And the way that they work is it's not dumping a chemical that's affecting you. It's not like how alcohol will just affect you or some other drug will just affect you. What it does is it comes in and it blocks right here so that when serotonin, which is the chemical that helps regulate your mood, when it fires into this gap, the medication will just help it not reabsorb into the original neuron quite as quickly. It lets your own serotonin hang out in the gap longer. And that way, more of it will absorb into the next one. So it's not, the medication is not creating the effect. All that it's doing is it's letting you use your serotonin more effectively. That's not the only class of medication. Like, again, it's obviously isn't a class on medication, but but that's the most common and for depression and a lot of like mild anxiety stuff. And so, and you've maybe heard of things like Celexa or Prozac or Trazodone or Cymbalta or Seroquel. Like those are like real common ones. The other thing is I'll hear this in group occasionally. I don't know if this would go around, but where people would say like, "Oh, you need Celexa. That's the best one." Like that's the different things work for different people. Like I prefer Tylenol. My wife prefers Advil. Right? Like different things work for different people, and it's the same with this type of medication. Okay, so why do you think most insurances won't cover counseling? Insurances are actually mandated to recover counseling, so they do. Some insurances are stingy about, they won't approve very many counselors. And that could, they can be stingy about that. I just speak, like Springhaven's fortunate because we have so many therapists that, like, we have people that are covered by pretty much everything. All of the private insurances, we don't cover like Medicaid or Medicare, but all the private ones we pretty much do. And we've had people lobby their insurance company before, and that's worked. So if that's an issue for you, it's something worth trying. You can call your insurance company and complain and say, like, there's not a counselor that fits for me in this radius. Can this person please get paneled? Can this person please get covered? And then that counselor or agency can then reapply to that insurance to get themselves covered in your plan. Okay, how are we doing on time? Oh, what am I supposed to? Okay. How do you help with panic attacks in the moment? How do you help with panic attacks in the moment? Okay, it's a great question. So, panic attacks are a rush of adrenaline. That is what they are. Like if you just step back and think about a panic attack, what is happening for most people is some combination of my heart is going faster, my breathing is going faster, my circulation has increased, which might create some feelings of feeling hot or sweaty or nauseous or tightness in the chest. And I might sweat and I may feel like cold. Okay, so that's what's happening in the body. Now, those sensations, those physical sensations are identical to riding a roller coaster. Okay? If you are healthy enough to ride a roller coaster, you can have a panic attack and they cannot harm you. It's not possible for them to, it's your own adrenaline. And again, if you have a serious heart condition and you can't ride a roller coaster, like, yeah, that's a different issue. But for most of us, a panic attack cannot harm us. What the main difference between riding a roller coaster and having a panic attack is while we're having a panic attack, we don't know why our body's doing it. It confuses us, right? I have people who, like, they get woke up from their sleep with a panic attack, or they, you know, like, I'm just sitting here doing nothing, and my body starts freaking out, right? So it's not knowing what it is feels scary. It feels scary. And so we're afraid. Well, our body has a fun way of dealing with fear. It gives us adrenaline. It gives us adrenaline. So, man, my body's going fast. Like, what's going on? I'm scared. You're scared. Your body said, okay, here's more adrenaline. I'm going even faster. What's happening? Okay, here's more adrenaline, right? Like, and it just keeps going, right? Most people who have a panic attack, their first panic attack, most people go to the emergency room. Most people think they're having a heart attack, and they go to the emergency room, which is fine, you know, like, but what helps with panic attacks is not being afraid of it. It can't hurt you. It's just an adrenaline rush. It can be, I begin to think of it as annoying or uncomfortable, right? Like, I get migraines occasionally. I don't enjoy migraines, right? But I'm not scared of them either. I'm like, oh, all right, well, go somewhere until this passes, right? So different people will sort of think about what helps them have their panic attack. You're not trying to fight against it. The biggest mistake most people make with panic attacks is they're trying to get rid of it. And they're like, oh no, I need to hurry up and stop this thing from happening. Oh, well, you're acting afraid of it, right? Which is gonna increase it. You don't need to hurry up and stop it. Let it happen. It's okay, just roll with it. Have your panic attack in peace, right? Once you're not afraid of it, then you're not producing any more adrenaline. It takes the average body about 20 minutes to metabolize adrenaline. Once you're not afraid of it, give it like 20 minutes. It'll be gone. So how do you like to have your panic attack? That's what I asked. How do you like to have it? You know, some people like to listen to music, you know, go to the room, listen to music. Some people like to talk about something, oh, let's talk about all this energy anyways. Like, it's just adrenaline, right? Yeah, just adrenaline. I'm going to go run. He had a treadmill in his room. He'd sprint hard. He'd just run for a few minutes. And they're like, oh, I burned the energy off. Yep, that's it. And so you not being afraid of it and helping them not be afraid of it by just like, okay, we're not trying to avoid them. We're just going to roll with them. When they happen, how do you do it? The reason panic attacks continue for most people is they continue to be afraid of it happening. So it is very, very common in treatment for people to stop having panic attacks at home. Like, they stop being afraid of it, and so they stop producing the extra adrenaline, and they stop having panic attacks at home. But they keep having them at school or at work, right? The issue is just they're afraid to have them at school or work, right? Like, that would be more embarrassing. They're afraid to have it. Once they figure that out, they'll stop there too. I had a girl who they stopped at home, they kept happening at work, and eventually she just talked to her boss and said, hey, I sometimes get panic attacks. They're not a big deal. Like, you don't need to be alarmed. They're not a big deal. But when I do, can I go to my car so I can just have my panic attack in peace? Can I just go to my car? And he said, yeah, no, hey, totally understand. He was a nice guy. Totally understand. I get it. No problem. We can do that. And then that was the last day they happened. Like, once she knew she could have them, She stopped being afraid of them happening. That was it. Now, I will say that I'm talking about pure panic attacks. Now, sometimes people have post-traumatic stress disorder, and a symptom of this post-traumatic stress disorder is panic, right? Okay, that's slightly different. You're going to need additional treatment to engage some of the other stuff. But for a pure panic disorder, that's all, just not being afraid of it in the moment, not trying to resist it or fight it. Just, yeah, go have it in peace. You know, give yourself about 20 minutes or so. It'll pass.
I had my second knee replaced, the doctor gave me tramadol for pain,
Yeah.
and it magnified my claustrophobia some fears. My daughter, the nurse, looked at her pharmacology book and it said one of the dangers of this stuff is it may cause panic attacks in patients over 65.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. No, I would guess not. I would guess not. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Okay, so I've got about 4 more questions, and I'm technically out of time. Do we want to take a little break, or do you want to hear a couple more? Maybe I'm looking for somebody. Go with the questions? Okay. All right. Does it seem that very religious people, for example, Amish, have more mental health issues due to fear of hell and condemnation if they're not able to obey all the rules? That's a good question. We work a lot with the Amish at Spring Haven, and so sometimes I get that question, people who just aren't familiar with, like, oh, I thought they didn't have any issues at all. Oh, do they have a ton of issues? Like, people just don't know. What I've learned through some time and intensive study is that Amish are in fact human, and that they tend to have mental health rates at about the same as everybody else. So that's been my big insight. The one exception is there's a specific form of obsessive compulsive disorder called scrupulosity, which is a heightened fear of moral mistake, right? So it's so obsessive compulsive disorder. I'll go into more details if somebody has, like, what is that? But it's a little long to explain just in this moment. But sometimes, so I've seen someone who was so afraid to lie, or that they might lie, even on accident, that they wouldn't speak, right? Like you'd see them start to form an idea, and then they weren't sure if it was completely honest, and then they'd just stop, right? So it's this called scrupulosity. It's a type of OCD. It's this excessive fear of, like, religious or moral mistake, failure. And there's not a study on it with the Amish. There's a study on it with Mormons, and they seem to be at higher rates with Mormons, and there's a study on it with, I forget the faith. There's a very conservative faith in the Middle East. But it does seem to us that we see it a little bit at slightly higher rates with the Amish than the general population. And it seems to be true of very conservative groups, that, like, a little bit higher rate of that one type. But everything else is about the same. All right, when we see a shift in someone, is there a way to distinguish if their issues are mental health versus drug abuse? If they're using drugs, it's drug abuse. It's you don't know if you don't see them using drugs or alcohol at all, then you don't know, right? Oftentimes, if you're finding drug paraphernalia or there is drug use happening, then that's a part of it. It's very common for them to be co-occurring, for them both to be happening. But you can't tell just by a person's behavior shift which one it is. You'd have to see signs of the drug use. All right. Yeah, do we have any resources for children dealing with anxiety, books, podcasts, and things? And so we do. I don't know of a podcast for anxiety for kids, but we have several different books. at Springhaven on our bookshelf. There's several different ones that can help. They vary greatly depending on what the issue is, right? And so there's books specifically for kids with obsessive compulsive disorder, and books for trauma, books for grief, books for separation anxiety. Like there's different ones, but those resources are out there. You could check our little bookshelf at Springhaven, or even if you search it like Amazon, you'll find stuff. But ours, you could contact Springhaven and for. Okay, this is the last one. When does mental illness become a psychosis? So the word psychosis just means a break from reality. It's usually hearing or seeing things that are not there, like hallucinations, seeing things that are not there. Sometimes it's excessively bizarre beliefs, like I believe that I can control your mind. I believe I'm the king of the world. So sometimes it's very bizarre belief or a hallucination. And it's a key part of schizophrenia. Psychosis can happen with other issues. It's possible. It can show up with bipolar, not always. So mental illness, it's not like mental illness becomes psychosis. It's that some forms of mental illness have psychosis and some don't, right? But that word just means a break from reality. How do we encourage family members on medication for chronic mental illness? What is this? For life, even when they feel so much better. Oh, I see. Yeah. Right. So sort of what we said maybe about medication is, right, like you can help them feel normal about it. You can encourage it. You can have them with a counselor who also is sort of saying the same thing you're saying, but it's coming from a different person. And so sometimes that clicks. And then you just have to hang with people, right? Like if they get off it, then you just, you have to wait. If they're an adult and they can make their own choice, then they're allowed to make their own choice, unfortunately. You just, when things begin to crash again, then you're there again. And like, hey, seems like things are, what can we do to help? I noticed you seem to be doing a lot better before, when you were on medication. Is that something we want to get back to? So try and catch them quickly is what I would suggest. Because no matter how much, we do provide a ton of education, but there's plenty of people that leave our office that I know, it doesn't matter what I say, they're going to try and get off at some point. And okay, well, that's okay. Let's get them back on so there's as little damage while they're off as possible. And hopefully they learn from that and don't do it a second time, right? Okay, that's it. That's the questions. Thank you all for, again, the question box is back there if you had anything else you wanted to drop in, and we'll have another little phase for questions at the end of the last section. But I think we have a little break here, 15 maybe minute break here. Yeah.
Yeah, let's reconvene in about 15 minutes, which would be like 11:10.